Hello again. What I want to do in this video is just take you through the notes, part 3 of the notes. Possibly we'll get on to part 4 as well. Maybe but that might be better off in a separate video. Um, Part 3 of the notes, as you will have noticed, the title is The Rules of Discourse, and the main topic of this, what would be this class, is what's called the pragmadialectical approach to argumentation. Okay. The pragmadialectical approach to argumentation is a very popular, very influential approach developed in Amsterdam. Within Europe, it's certainly the main approach. Possibly nowadays everywhere it's the main approach. Some criticism of it is grow. Or let's say people are becoming a little more critical of it. However, the man at the center of it, a man called Van Imeren, is an extremely influential figure in that he is the editor of the Argumentation Journal. He's also the editor of a series of books on argumentation, and he's in charge of the one of the main conferences, which is held in Amsterdam every 4 years. And he's not very open to criticism of his system. In fact, he's completely closed to criticism of his system, which he thinks is perfect. So even people who work in Amsterdam, that they are kind of, well, they're stuck. They most of them work using his system, and if they don't want to, then he's not very interested in what they're doing. So just as a little introduction there. Okay. The reason that this way of looking at argumentation is important for us is that it's actually based on linguistics rather than philosophy, right? So informal logic is very much based on philosophy, but this approach to argument is born out of linguistics. It's born out of the work of people like Searle and Grice, whom I'm not sure you probably have mentioned in Introduction to Linguistics classes. But anyway, they are linguists putting forward rules about how discourse works. Okay, so that's the basis for this theory. It's about the rules of discourse. The name, of course, tells you a lot about what the theory is about. So it's pragmatics and it's dialectic. So I hope that you know what pragmatics means. You should have done that in your linguistics classes. So that's the bit which is really from linguistic theory. So it's about looking at the meaning in certain situations, in certain contexts. So within the context of particular arguments, of the particular function of the argument is very important. The second part, dialectic. I mean, dialectic is this very long tradition of philosophical debate that takes place usually as a dialogue, right? So there is some question over whether dialogue and dialectic are really exactly the same thing, but they come from the same root. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with, for example, the works of Plato. Plato wrote dialogues, right? So all of his philosophical work it's a little bit like a play. Generally, you have the character of Socrates, and then you have various other people who argue with Socrates. And of course, arguing with Socrates is not a very good idea. You always lose. And Plato uses Socrates to put forward his own views, of course. Although he knew Socrates, so maybe some of what he says is based on Socrates as well. Anyway, the point is that dialectic is a way of reaching philosophical truths through dialogue, right? Through an exchange. So one person says something and another person answers, and in this way you reach the truth. So argumentation in this system of pragmadialectics is seen as a dialogue normally between two sides. I mean, it can be between more sides, but basically it's conceived as being between two sides. And what's acceptable in that dialogue is based on the rules of pragmatics, which come from linguistics. Okay, so this is the basic setup that we have. One of the things that I mentioned right at the beginning of the notes, I say that there is a normative element to the study of reasoning. The word normative appears very often. in this type of work. So I just make sure that we all know what we mean by that. So when we say something normative, we're talking about norms, and this means what you should and shouldn't do. So when we talk about studying reasoning from a normative element, we're talking about what is good and bad reasoning, what are good and bad practices in reasoning. Not just describing how people actually do reason, but by saying how they should reason and they should argue. Okay, so pragma dialectics looks to set out a system of rules for how you should go about arguing. Okay. Okay. I mentioned in the notes that there is a book in which they sum up that this was started before Rob Grutendorf died, but he is no longer with us. So of course this is the last work which is shared by the two of them. Previous to this, there were many articles and some books as well, which then sort of build up a theory, and then they produced this book, a systematic theory of argumentation. They call it systematic. That's their own idea that it's systematic. Since then, Van Imeren has taken on the idea and has moved into other things, particularly into argument maneuvering, something that he talks about, the way that we maneuver in arguments, but all within the framework of pragma dialectics. However, that book it's a very useful book if anybody is interested in doing anything on pragma dialectics, purely because it gives from the beginning to the end the whole theoretical background and how the idea, how they saw the idea right at the end when Grutendorf was at the end. Okay, so it can be seen as a sort of final report on everything that they did together, as I mentioned. Okay, so as I said, the background is very much in linguistics, but there are some particular elements that are worth mentioning. So what they're looking at is something which we call problem validity, right? So problem validity, we mean how useful the reasoning is in solving a particular problem. So argumentation is always seen as being used in pragma dialectics to solve a problem, and the problem is that two people don't agree about something. Okay, so in order to solve the problem in the dialectical situation, you've got two people who don't agree. So by solving the problem, you reach a situation where the two people do agree. Now what that means is that all of the rules are based around helping those two people agree. But basically, so long as those two people agree, then everything is fine. So it's not about some outside standards of truth. It isn't really about finding the truth, finding out what is really the right answer. It's about resolving the problem between the two people. Okay, so that's why it's much more about the study of communication between people than it is about philosophical truth, right? So Van Imeren and his colleagues, they work in the Department of Communication at Amsterdam University, right? So it's not philosophy, it's not linguistics, it's about communication between people. That's what they're getting at. Okay. So there is always a difference of opinion. Okay, so there is a quotation in the notes where it says, the pragma dialectical theory of argumentation regards each argumentation as part of an explicit or implicit discussion between parties who try to resolve a difference of opinion that may be implicit by testing the standpoints concerned. Okay, so they use the word standpoint. They don't use conclusion. They don't talk about arguments and conclusion. They talk about standpoints. So the standpoint is your point of view. And the idea is that the two people in the discussion have different standpoints, right? If you have the same standpoint, then you don't need to argue about it. And so these standpoints must be tested by argumentation. So rather than putting forward arguments as proof of a standpoint, you have a standpoint and then it's tested through the process of argumentation, okay? And this is dialectical because what happens is that there is a dialogue between somebody who supports the standpoint and somebody who opposes the standpoint, what they call the proponent and the opponent, okay? So this is known as a critical discussion, okay? So there is a critical discussion of a particular standpoint, and the two parties try to reach some sort of agreement. Okay, very important element, the stages of the critical discussion, right? So there are 4 stages. There's the confrontation stage, the opening stage, the argumentation stage, and the concluding stage.